Um, so there's a little chat button down there as well. If you want to chat with everybody else, I see there's a few people doing that. I'm not going to pull questions out of the chat because it's too random. So if you got a question, I've got a couple questions for you, Jeff. The book is called Walkable City Rules, 101 Steps to Making Better Places. Why? Yeah, thank you. Why 101? Why did you just get to 100 and say, I got to do one more?
As my 8-year-old said, there should be a subtitle, not Dalmatians. No, I mean, I knew it was going to be about 100 when I started putting it together. I knew it was going to be 100, and I just thought 101 was catchier. I have no more intellectual explanation.
Well, you're kind of a nonconformist. I think 99 and 100 would have been kind of standard, but it's like you up the ante by one, set a new bar.
I did actually. I was already at 101 rules, but I added a rule. I had to consolidate 2 rules at the end to add one. So in a sense, 101 is in keeping with the spirit, which is I thought I was done, and then I had to add one more.
Right. Talk a little bit about your inspiration for this specific book. Why was 101 rules needed in the marketplace of books?
Well, I wrote Walkable City 6 years. I should say I published Walkable City 6 years ago. And when you finish a book, you think you're never going to write another book. And it did a lot of the things I wanted to do, and it had a fair amount of detail in there and data in there and other things that made it a bit of a tool. But it was really conceived of as, hopefully like literary nonfiction. And right. I remember actually when I was working on Suburban Nation with Andres and Adwani and Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk, I talked to Witold Rybczynski, and he's, probably the biggest seller of books about design anywhere. And his main advice for Suburban Nation was to have no pictures.
Wow.
And he said, if you have pictures, it'll be back in the architecture section or the design section. If you have no pictures, it'll be in front with the current affairs.
Okay.
And I said, well, that's great. And that's probably right. But Suburban Nation was actually based on a lecture that Andres used to give, and then other stuff by Liz. It was a very visual, the towns versus sprawl argument was a very visual argument. Right. I'm going to turn my email off so it stops beeping. Hold on for a second. Quit mail. And so it couldn't be a book without pictures. Walkable City, though, was a book about, not just how to be more walkable, but why to be more walkable. And it was really meant to be a conversation with people who aren't just into design. I found it was very easy to write it as a book that was something that would hopefully go in the front of the store. And I think that actually worked. Like, it sold a lot of copies. It still sells very well. And I keep meeting people who had never read a planning book until they read Walkable City. So it managed to talk to a lot of people who wouldn't necessarily have been drawn to a book that looked more like a design book. But then people would complain to me that there were no pictures. That's fine. But the stories I was hearing was that people were like, they were convinced by it, and they go to hearings and they'd like shout things and hold the book up and say, it's in here or whatever.
Right.
But then they found that they felt kind of stranded ultimately because it didn't have enough data, enough details, enough diagrams, charts, pictures. It doesn't say that an angle parking space should be this deep if it's 45 degrees and that deep if it's 60 degrees, and how thick does the travel lane have to be behind it if you're going to back out without hitting the opposing traffic and all that stuff. And so I wanted to have one book that would have really almost every tool that you need to do the kind of work in communities that my colleagues and I do, which is, to make them more walkable, to make them more livable, or to try. And so I gave myself a new task, which was both to kind of include all that information, but also to organize it in a way that's simple, simple and super easy to use. So the 101 rules, each rule, I'll pick a random rule like 45, cut the extra lanes.
Yep.
And each rule is 2 pages and has like a headline and a subtitle and then a bunch of text explaining what to do, some pictures that show befores and afters, and places you can go to see how it's been done. And then actually there's a rule at the end. So this one's called Cut the Extra Lanes. When lanes are not needed for traffic, all they do is cause speeding. And then the rule at the bottom is find those streets in your city where the supply of lanes exceeds the demand for them and convert the extra lanes to other uses. And that's something we do all over the place, and we make the argument, and I make the argument elsewhere in the book about induced demand, and you can reduce lanes without causing traffic congestion and all those arguments. But, those are tough arguments to work from in communities. Most of the change that I've been able to make in communities has been actually finding just extra lanes where there's a mismatch between demand for lanes and supply of lanes. Then you can take those lanes and turn them into bike lanes or into more parking or other things.
Right.
So that's a rule about how to do that. And it really does get into the details. So, and it's organized like many new urbanist things. It's organized from the scale of the region to the scale of the building. And it's in 19, I couldn't get 20, I tried. It's in 19 chapters. Super easy to find, what you're looking for. So, just to look at a bit of it, one chapter is called Sell Cycling. So, okay, I want to convince people to have more bike lanes in my community. That's a section with 3 rules. There's a section called, focus on intersections. And that includes 5 rules, make great crosswalks, keep signals simple, bag the beg buttons and countdown clocks, replace signals with always stop signs, and build naked streets and shared spaces. So, it's meant to be, I would love it if people would read the book from end to end. And I wrote it, I hope, to be entertaining enough that people would make that choice, but it's much more of a tool and a reference. So the elevator pitch is that it weaponizes Walkable City for deployment in the field, which is a little bit macho, but you get the idea.
I felt like the Walkable City was a book that I could recommend not only to people who were technical professionals, but also to just people who I could recommend this one to my mom, like my mom, the teacher, say, hey, this is going to open your eyes and help out a little bit. I feel like with the 101 rules, what you've done is in that same spirit of being able to communicate to technical people, but also to non-technical people. You've formatted this in a way that I think is universal. Talk about, was that your intent? And I guess, what's the audience you are trying to reach here? Is it professionals or is it everybody?
It's funny because I'm going to readings or book events and they're set up by my publisher, Island Press, great publisher, and they were a real pleasure to work with. And I asked the audience, is my publisher here? And then I'm like, okay, some of you should not be buying this book. Some of you should be buying my other book.
Right.
Which is a different publisher. But in all honesty, I don't think this book will find as large an audience as Walkable City did, because it's not designed to. It is meant for people who are involved in this work. Now, that's a lot of people. That's, of course, all the planners, all the public officials, planning board, zoning board people. It's citizen activists. It's people who care about their community and want to make their community better. But someone who wants an entertaining read on the subject of city planning, or just to learn a bit about what city planning is and how it relates to their lives, then I would still send them towards Walkable City.
Yeah. Let me switch to a question here from Roger. He says, we get a lot of pushback on 10-foot wide travel lanes. Is there additional professional reference coming to validate narrower lanes?
So
one of your favorite topics, I know.
I know. It's, I wrote an article in City Lab about that, if he's interested, that talks about all of I think it's called Why 12-Foot Lanes Are a Disaster. That was the headline they put on it. It was like, why 12-foot lanes are a disaster for safety or society or something like that.
It's a great article. Yeah.
But I spend so much time on that because I think it really matters. And there's 4 whole points here. Right size the lanes. The first one is adopt a 10-foot standard for free flow lanes, understanding that local lanes can be narrower, right?
Right.
And then restripe to a 10-foot standard, which talks about how to do it properly. And then I go on to talk about building slow flow and yield flow streets, as well as expanding the fire chief's mandate, which means hey, you're really responsible for public safety and public health, not for getting to the accident quickly, which your streets caused to happen because they were too wide, right? But I talk in the book about all the information I have, which is the the NACTO decision. The National Association of City Transportation Officials makes it very clear that 10 feet is an appropriate width for travel lanes. I talk about the AASHTO statement that if you want people, it basically, I don't remember exactly how it goes, but what it clearly states and implies is that if you don't want people going more than 45 miles an hour, the lane should not be wider than 10 feet, right?
Right.
So I've got that data in here. I've got a nice graph that shows how travel speed increases with lane width. So it's all the data I could find. So it is all gathered there. There's no, since NACTO, there's no additional thing that I've heard about. I have some issues with the NACTO book because they say and they show that bus lanes may be, not should be, bus lanes may be 11 feet wide.
Yeah.
And, of course, most transit agencies want the largest lanes they can have, but I'm quite convinced, and I've seen in operation in many places, that in a multi-lane street in which, the lane lines are not walls, right?
Right, right.
Walls.
No, there's some movement there, right?
That having you don't need lanes wider than 10 feet to hold an 8.5-foot bus. And of course, having the lanes wider than that just causes the buses to speed and trucks to speed.
I was going to say, I think the limiting factor there is you can have 10-foot lanes at neighborhood speeds. If the goal is to get things up really fast, you will have problems at 10-foot lanes.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. But what's the worst that can happen if a bus in a 10-foot lane passes another bus in a 10-foot lane with two buses parked on the side of the street, in 8-foot parking spaces? First of all, that absolutely never in the history of the world has happened. Right. Secondly, what it would cause is, some friction that would make the speed safer.
Everybody would have to slow down. And that's actually the goal in walkable places.
So I actually quote in my book the one transit agency that gets it that I've met in America, which is Des Moines.
Okay.
And the head of the Des Moines Transit Agency says, we understand that most transit rides begin and end as a walk, and pedestrians are our customers, and we don't want to do anything to thin our customer base.
Right.
So we want 10-foot lanes so that pedestrians feel more comfortable.
Roger, in his question, alluded to being from Minnesota. So I'm going to add an extra Minnesota thing onto this. I know some of the pushback that we get here for 10-foot lanes is you need room for snow storage. I'm going to let you tackle that one because I know you've been to places where it snows.
So I was in Minnesota a week ago or 2 weeks ago.
You were in Grand Forks, right?
I crossed the bridge from Grand Forks, North Dakota. And if being in an airport doesn't count as visiting a state, then I've got really sad news for you, because it means Minnesota was my last state and not North Dakota. But the story there is that you need to go to places where it snows a lot that have narrow lanes, and of course they're all over the place. The cute way to answer the question is, the narrower the street, the less you have to plow. Right. But the real answer is, where is your snow storage? Do you have snow emergency? Because of course they do. So no one's parking in the parking lanes during snow emergency. But more to the point, what's the boulevard section between the roadway and the sidewalk where you can store the snow? The only place where it's a real issue is in places where there's so much snow, like Butte, Montana, or ski towns, way up in the mountains, that they actually tent it in the middle of the street.
Right.
And if they're doing that, then for example, I did a plan for Butte, and we really couldn't have the protected bike lanes. We couldn't have the cycle tracks because that caused the street to be so narrow that there was nowhere to tent. But what we did do was add a lot of, these streets aren't very wide. We added integrated bike lanes, and it's great because no one's biking in the snowstorm anyway. Right. So the 5 or 6 extra feet on the side of the street for the bicycles actually give you the room that you need to push the cars outward to tent the snow in the middle when there's a snowstorm. So that's a solution in the worst kind of place. Well, not worse. No,
you and I have, you and I were both in Driggs, Idaho. I know I brought this up before. And when I was there, I actually drove over to Jackson, and it's like driving through a tunnel in some places with the amount of snow they get. These streets still don't have to be obnoxiously wide. I mean, there's ways to do this. And like you say, in the winter and summer, there are two different conditions, you know? Yeah.
But I mean, it's not they don't have to be obnoxiously wide. I mean, the simple fact is that there's a lot of places, you know, older communities like Marblehead, Massachusetts, for example, where, or parts of Boston, honestly, where, the street gets super tight when it snows a ton. But those are school days anyway. I mean, those are no school days anyway.
Right.
Yeah.
This is a kind of a longer one. I'll try to summarize here. Josh asking, he says, my city's looking at a redesign of a small street. I spoke at the council meeting about slowing the cars and narrowing the lanes in the name of pedestrian and bike safety. The city said this design is a win because the new sidewalks will meet the ADA, but there's still 3 lanes and it's 12 feet wide. They said the engineer recommended 3 lanes, 12 feet due to traffic counts. What's your advice on taking it to the next level? You know, why is it not, why is that not walkable just because it now meets ADA?
Well, clearly you need to meet ADA, and that's fine. I'm curious, 3 lanes, it sounds probably like it's a one-way street. We can ask him to.
My guess, I'll give you my local example. We just did this too. And the state engineer said, you know, now we've got a great walkable street. 3 lanes was 2 lanes and a center turn lane.
Right.
You know, so 2 directions and then narrow sidewalks on the side, but they meet the ADA requirements. Yeah.
Well, it matters what the lane widths are. You know, I talk a lot, and we new urbanists talk a lot about the 4-to-3 road diet.
Right.
So if you have a 4-lane street that's 2-way, and you convert it to a 3-lane street that's 2-way, as I've done, many of us have done in lots of different places. If you keep the lanes the proper width, that's a much safer street and no less capacity, because 4-lane streets are super inefficient. 3-lane streets are super efficient. But whether or not the street's a 1-way or a 2-way, the first question is, what's the car count? Let's say it's a 2-way street. If the car count is 10,000 or less, then there's no point for that 3rd lane or for turn lanes at intersections. When I did the plan for downtown Oklahoma City, the traffic engineer there, very enlightened, Laura Story, she made a rule based on my recommendation that if there were no more than 10,000 cars per day at an intersection, you couldn't put in a left turn lane, which cities do without thinking everywhere all the time now.
All the time, yeah.
Right. But what that does is, of course, it causes speeding. Now, if it's a 1-way street, then you can count on 600, 800 cars per peak hour in each lane. And you're going to come up with an answer as to how many lanes you need to have to handle the traffic that you're currently experiencing and with a reasonable growth rate are anticipating. So that's the first question, is how many lanes do you need based on the car counts? And all that, all those formulas are in the book. Secondly, though, there's actually been a study done by the Florida DOT that said something that's fairly obvious, which is that streets with 12-foot lanes have no greater capacity than streets with 10-foot lanes.
Right.
Because you actually can fit 2 cars in a 12-foot lane, but of course no one does, right? So since it's 1 car per lane, per however many seconds, there is 0 capacity gain by making the lanes wider. What you do get is a speed gain. And by the way, one thing I talk about in the book, one of my rules is called, it's something like frame it in terms of speeding, which is I never go to a place and say, we're going to slow the cars down. I say, I'm here to help you stop illegal speeding.
Right.
Because we just want cars to go the speed limit. And when you get them to, slow down about the 7 miles an hour or so that they're tending to average above the speed limit in a local street, that makes everyone happy because you're eliminating speeding. But we don't say we're going to make their trips slower.
Right. Let me ask this question from Sylvia. She says she lives in Ontario, and they have a rule there limiting curb parking in residential areas to 3 hours. She's tried to talk to them about getting rid of this rule, but she's getting pushback from things like snow clearance, fire trucks, and people don't like them. Planning says they can't get rid of the minimum parking requirements for residential areas because of enforcing that parking rule. Any advice? So it sounds like a chicken and an egg kind of problem in a sense. They're requiring all this off-street parking in residential areas because you can only park on the street for 3 hours.
Right. So they need to keep the minimum parking requirements because there is no capacity on the street because of the 3-hour rule.
Right.
I happen to live in a community, Brookline, Massachusetts, which is a suburb surrounded by Boston, very urban. I'm right on the streetcar line. You might hear it as I'm speaking at some points. That doesn't allow overnight parking on any of its streets. And when I moved here, I was like, that's preposterous. That's ridiculous. I'll get rid of that.
Right.
And of course, I realized, I learned pretty quickly that it wasn't worth trying because it's actually one of the ways that the community, you could say it limits the amount of housing in the community, for better or for worse.
Right.
It also limits, I would say it does to a certain degree limit the amount of driving in the community because it limits the number of cars in the community. And actually we have a condition here. It definitely limits car ownership. The typical person in Brookline owns, I'd say, 1 car per family, as opposed to, 2, which is more standard in other places. There are a lot of people who live here without cars. And that rule probably helps in that regard. But I would say in most suburban places, when you don't allow the parking on the street, you're actually widening the street effectively and causing people to drive a lot faster. And there really isn't a good reason for that 3-hour rule, unless it's a retail location where you want to churn the shoppers at the curb and not have the workers or the store owners taking up the parking that's for shoppers.
Right.
It doesn't sound like that's the condition. So I would be very curious to learn where the rule comes from, and because very few places have a rule like that. I know in a lot of New Jersey also you're not allowed to park on the streets overnight, but it's kind of an outdated concept.
I wonder if you have any thoughts, because one of the things that Sylvia mentioned was, they want to keep that turnover for emergency response and snow removal. And how do you talk to cities and decision makers about the difference between kind of peak events and unique events and like the standard everyday, here's how we're going to use this most of the time?
Well, that part of the question actually made no sense to me because, 3-hour parking 3-hour parking limit isn't going to do anything regarding snow removal.
Right.
You need to have a storm emergency rule in effect. And in terms of emergency vehicles, well, who knows if there's a fire when you've got your 3 hours, when you're in the middle of your 3 hours. So that's that's a bad way to solve the problem. There are more direct ways to solve the problem.
Right.
So, but you asked a bigger question. Oh, so was it, how do I talk about how do I talk about what?
I think a lot of times, and I've seen this too, where when we go out to design something, whether it's the amount of parking or whether it's the lane width or, what have you, what we tend to design for is the peak event. Here's the big thing we got going on. How should we be thinking about peak events in relationship to our design of spaces that for most times are not in peak events?
Right. So your question kind of implies the answer, which is that we want to design a place that functions the 99% of the time that people are in it, for as many people that are, for all the different people that are in it. And, if you optimize a street for all of the peak events factors that it might experience, you'd have no room for houses. I mean, it's impossible to add them all up. So, the first one is to say, let's think about most of the people most of the time. The second thing is to say the peak event is a management problem, not a design problem. And, I've worked in a lot of places where, you're hiring police and other folks to manage traffic in those unusual conditions. And I think most cities have those things that happen on a regular basis, fairs and festivals where they're even closing streets and doing other stuff. And yeah, you need a retinue of police and other people to help you out, but management's one of the tools that's available to you.
Right. I'm interested in how you respond to this. Here's from Paige. My city of Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, which I've been to. I don't know if you've been to.
I did a walkability study there. One of my least effective.
Okay, well then you will. I'm very interested in how you'll answer this. My city of Bethlehem, Pennsylvania is just starting feasibility studies for a pedestrian bridge project. What are the pitfalls we should avoid in this process?
So I've done about 14 walkability studies in different cities. One of the earliest was Bethlehem. Some of my studies have led to complete redesign of all the streets in a downtown, like in New Albany, Indiana, or in downtown Oklahoma City. Some of them have led to very little. It's a function of the politics and the conditions on the ground. Bethlehem was the one that produced perhaps the least outcomes, but it did result in some downtown streets being reconfigured. If you ask them, they'll say they did a lot. I would say they didn't do a lot, but some downtown streets were reconfigured. Parking was altered so that lanes would be the right width, all that sort of thing. I'm curious whether this pedestrian bridge is across the river in Bethlehem or if it's across the street. Because obviously that's two different things.
That is interesting. I'll wait and see if if Paige adds something to the thing, because
the general point about pedestrian bridges or tunnels.
It's across Lehigh, she says.
Across the Lehigh, I believe it's the Lehigh River, I believe.
Okay.
Yeah. So
okay.
That's a simpler question, which is, a simpler question to answer, which is that, that's a bridge which is going to increase mobility. It's not providing an alternative to crossing a street. And, in most cases when cities create pedestrian bridges or tunnels over busy streets, no matter what you do, people end up crossing the street anyway, right?
Right.
And people hate to go up and down. They much rather risk their lives. They don't want to go through a tunnel that smells like, something from the human body. And so those generally are a bad alternative to the proper solution, which is to bite the bullet and put a proper signal there that's going to impede traffic a little bit as it goes through, just to allow that phase for pedestrians to go through. If you're building a pedestrian bridge across a river, good on you, as they'd say in Australia. But yeah, you just got to make sure that it's got ample width to handle pedestrians and cyclists without them getting in each other's way. That's about it.
How do you approach?
Don't hire Calatrava because he'll bank.
How do you? I mean, we had this thing happen down in Miami with the elevated bridge collapsing, and I think that put a lot of focus on that type of design. Are there places where a pedestrian bridge is something that makes sense? And I guess, is there a rule for, because it's funny because here in my little town where there's no traffic, I brought up, the need to get people across the highway through the middle of town. And my city manager, the very first response was, well, let's go we'll put in a pedestrian bridge. Yeah. Are there places where it actually makes some sense?
Yeah, railroad tracks.
Okay.
And highways. I mean, a true highway.
Yeah.
You may have a road going through that's just won't accept a signal. That's high speed. So yeah, I mean, there's absolutely places. There's absolutely places for it. But where you see them being deployed in most cases is a street that even has regular intersections with signals, but someone died there.
Right.
So instead of fixing the signals and making the cars a little bit more inconvenienced, they say, let's put the bridge in.
Here's a question from Jake, a good friend of mine from, I know he's from Fergus Falls, Minnesota. For improving walkability of established neighborhoods without sidewalks, where mature trees and citizen resistance makes putting in those sidewalks difficult, do walking lanes at the street level, like with striping or something like that, does that work? And have you seen places where that's been well received?
I've certainly recommended it in a bunch of places. Ideally, you get some sort of physical barrier, like a little curb. A wonderful example that you see a fair amount, but it's for sidewalks, but you could easily use it in another condition. You see in a number of the bridges over Rock Creek Park in Washington, D.C., are these kind of metal barriers that are only about this tall.
Okay.
But they're very solid. They're made of nice kind of tubular steel, as opposed to your typical highway, thin, ugly barriers.
Sure.
And they give you absolute confidence as a pedestrian that you're not going to get hit because they're very strong. The question there is, what's the width of the roadway? And chances are there's a shoulder or there is additional width where you can narrow it to 20 feet, like exactly 20 feet, even narrower in a pinch, right? I mean, 9-foot travel lanes work. It's just a question of getting away with it technically, right? Or politically. But, and then you probably want to pick one side of the street and not the other because there's not enough room for both. And there's so little pedestrian traffic that you don't really need to have both, right?
Right.
And then delineating it with paint, but ideally some sort of physical object, you know, be it little, you know, armadillos they're called, or this barrier that I talked about, or something just to make it. I mean, that's certainly better than having no sidewalks. Absolutely.
Right. Right. It's interesting here in Minnesota. We get the pushback always from having the vertical element being, well, now, you know, we can't snowplow this. Now, you know, we can't keep this clean. What do you, have you seen something that works in snow areas? Is it just, do we do it just during the summer months? Is it something that is removed in the winter, or is there something that you'd recommend?
Yeah. I mean, it's a little more expensive to go down into the street, right?
Right.
But the idea of a kind of a mountable curb that's just a very slight angle. We're doing something like this in Michigan, where we're making the street narrower than the snowplows want it to be, and the median that we're putting in just has a mountable edge, almost like a rumble strippy kind of thing. So yeah, and that's still better than nothing for a pedestrian.
Right. Yeah. All right, David. David had another question at the top that I had a hard time reading, but he's come back with a second one. And I apologize, David, for not adding your first one. I'm going to try to circle back to it and see if maybe it was just me. Are there examples? Here's his question. Are there examples of doing TOD, transit-oriented development, where the community has recognized the added value of transportation stations by using publicly owned or by purchasing underutilized malls in advance of future development? This might keep the profits regionally concentrated, doing things smarter, ? So
No.
I'll let you react to that one. Go ahead. No.
I mean, I'm not aware of a city, you know, making that sort of investment. It may have happened. If it's happened, I'm not aware of it.
Right.
By the way, you said TOD and the trains are going by outside. I don't know if you can hear them.
What is, let me delve into this one just a little bit. When you are located, let me give you a little, I was in Akron, Ohio last week. And there was a film crew there doing a documentary that wanted a little bit of my time. And we went out to this kind of failing mall, and we're there in the parking lot for about an hour. And I think the saddest thing was that across the Strode from the parking lot, there was a little, it's like it was a junky bus stop, right? But it was clear that this was a bus stop getting a lot of use, because the whole time we were there, people kept pouring across these parking lots, to the bus stop, back across the Strode, back and forth, people in wheelchairs and scooters, and buses kept coming in and out and in and out. It seemed to me to be like a really poorly located, bus stop. Obviously not a bus stop with TOD. There was no, the transit-oriented development was the parking lot of the mall and like a muffler shop and that kind of thing. When we're locating transit facilities like that, how do we do them so that you are getting better walkability, better use? What are some of the mistakes that transit agencies make when they're doing these things?
Well, I talk about like the crisis of the last 100 yards, which is even in urban areas. I think this trend is waning, but even in urban areas, for many years that the idea of the transit stop as an intermodal facility, a park and ride, even in a city, right? A park and ride, a kiss and ride, and a place to transfer, for example, from train to bus, caused a lot of the interface between the vehicle and the walkable part of the downtown to be separated by about 100 yards of parking and other kind of turbine-like facilities for moving cars and buses around, and then killing ridership among those who have a choice, right? A lot of people don't have a choice, and that's what we're experiencing at the mall.
That's
But
what I was seeing in Akron.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's always a struggle. I'm working on a TOD right now in Newton, Massachusetts, which is one of the ends of the Green Line. The Green Line in Boston leaves underground, comes out, passes by my house, but has 4 different branches, one of which ends at a place called Riverside. And currently Riverside has a huge surface parking lot. And we're doing the classic TOD solution, which is to turn the surface parking lot, which people come from all around, including New Hampshire, to park there to go to Red Sox games, among other things. It's a huge parking lot. And we can't make it go away. It's very important to the T and to people. So we're turning that into a parking structure, which is freeing up like 10 acres or more of land for 1.5 million square feet of development that we hope to put there. And there was a previous plan for the site that literally created under the parking structure. You can just imagine how pleasant this would have been. Under the parking structure, this massive bus circulation system that would hold a dozen buses, and you would get off the train, you go under the parking structure and find your bus, even though there's like maybe 2 buses an hour going through this place. It's not a massive exchange. Then there was another place for looping for the handicap van, and another place for looping for the kiss and ride. And each of these was little turbines located in the previous plan that destroyed the walkability of the place. We've redesigned it with a town square. And the town square has room in it for 6 buses to park. It has room in it. It has a loop in it for the handicap van. It has a loop in it for the kiss and ride, but it looks and feels like a town square. And in fact, we took the parking lot, in order to create the town square, we took the parking lot and we moved it about 200 feet from the train stop. So that creates actually a place where people will shop, because there's a distance between the 2 anchors of the train and the parking lot, for example. But if you think of it as, if the goal is we're trying to make a town, and then, oh yeah, the buses have to work, as opposed to, we're making a transportation processing facility that people will have to live in, it results in a very different outcome.
I was going to ask you about that kind of mindset. How much of this is just, I know it's easy, and I'll put this on me, not on you. I know it's easy to bash traffic engineers and transit planners as being kind of myopic and, focused on one thing. How much of it is, though, the fact that we made this a lot about efficiency and not really about humans and life and place?
There's a fun book by Darren Nordahl, Nordal, called My Kind of Transit. I don't know if you've seen it. He was the town planner for Davenport, Iowa. It's called My Kind of Transit. And he makes that argument. In some ways, it's the anti-Jarrett Walker argument. He makes the argument that, transit is movable public space. And we need to make it we need to be placemaking with our vehicles and placemaking with everything we do around transit if we want people to use it. The Jarrett Walker argument, which I think is ultimately more important, and he shares it with Paul Moore and the Nelson Nygaard guys and all the people who are really revolutionizing bus networks all around the US, is that yes, efficiency and short transfers is what's going to get you the most ridership. And of course, we're all guilty, to use Jarrett Walker's term, we're all guilty of elite projection. And we're in danger of designing transit systems around the pleasurable experience we want to have, as opposed to the fact that for many people, it is their lifeline to get everywhere that they're going throughout the city. But there's efficiency in terms of, and what these guys are doing, in terms of redesigning networks to be really functional. And I get into how you do that in the book. And of course, I got it from Jarrett, and Jarrett helped me to describe the way that not many, but a good number of cities are reshaping their bus networks in a way that it costs no more money to run the buses, but they're providing a much more robust system of frequent transfers that are getting people where they're going a lot faster. But that's a different approach from saying, we have to move the vehicles speedily through these station areas, which then erodes the creation of place in those areas.
Right. All right. Kristen says, I'm working in Manatee County, Florida, which I've been. I kind of like Manatee County, Florida. Are there any insights you might be able to provide about on-site stormwater retention? It seems to me that the practice is spreading things out even more rapidly than parking would, but I don't necessarily understand the dynamics. And then she says, this wasn't a thing in Ohio or in North Carolina.
Well, it's more of an issue in Florida for
That's
good
true.
reason. And I lived in Florida for a decade working with DPZ, and we were incredibly frustrated in trying to make, the sort of urbanism that would cause people not to drive and thereby help the environment, by the environmental rules that would cause us to spread everything out due to stormwater. There's no easy answer to meeting those requirements in a way that makes urbanism more possible. But the biggest thing that we would fight, and I don't know what the state laws are right now, but the biggest discussion that was somewhat tenuous and flippable was when you take like a strip center or a dead mall or some other 100% or mostly paved site, and you want to turn it into a mixed-use walkable community, do you have to satisfy the current stormwater prevention requirements?
Right.
Or could you just make it a little bit better than it is now?
Mm-hmm.
Because the fact is that the rules in Florida currently, if you inherit a 100% paved site, well, not currently, when I was last working there, so like a decade ago, if you inherit a 100% paved site, you have to, you can't just improve it. You got to improve it to the current standard, which basically makes urbanism impossible on that site. Right.
I've also found, just from an engineering design standpoint, having been on kind of both sides of this, the engineering and like the permitting side, we will often design for, 100-year storm events, really very intense levels of runoff, and essentially assess or tax or pay for this massive stormwater system in an urban area. And then when we go to do the permitting on the other side, which is there's kind of a wall between those two, a wall of not only technical expertise and understanding, but they don't talk to each other.
Right.
We will require the same stormwater management on a place with very expensive stormwater utility in place as we do on the greenfield lot out on the edge where none of that exists.
Yeah.
Do you see that a lot happening?
That is something I can't speak to. I haven't had your experience there.
Okay.
So we'll talk about things I know.
All right. This is one Ronald wants to know, are there any recommendations on how to prevent a city council from adopting Appendix D of the International Fire Code? And he said requiring the 26-foot access roads. And he goes on to talk about, the fire district uses their worst case examples, Jeff, you want to have this blood on your hands, when children die, come on. Right.
So I'm wondering if it's appropriate for this venue for me to do a little reading.
Go for it. No, please. That'd be fantastic.
But means I have to find it. But I talked about one of my rules was called expand the fire chief's mandate, right?
Right.
Which is 51.
Right.
And I talked about that exactly.
I think, by the way, I've been in this conversation a long time, and I've tried to state it in different ways. The way you are framing it there is really brilliant, and that is changing what we're asking fire people to do. So please go ahead.
And I got that from fire chiefs, actually. So shift the focus from response time to public safety. Perhaps the most, actually, Chuck, I thought of you when I was writing this. There's a sentence I'm gonna pause after, because when I finish that sentence, I'm like, that sounds like something that Chuck would write. So,
well, I'm flattered already.
Perhaps the most ironic day in the life of every city planner is the one in which she discovers that her greatest opponent in making her city streets safer is the fire chief. How this bizarre circumstance has come to occur in city after city across the United States is a veritable morality play on the topics of siloed thinking, the confusion of ends and means, and Murphy's Law. And it goes something like this. That was my Marohn moment.
Beautiful.
The fire chief's job performance is typically judged on response time. The fire department's budget is often based on the number of calls that fire trucks respond to. These two facts conspire to replace a fire chief's natural mandate, optimizing the life safety of the community, with a much narrower focus, sending out lots of trucks and getting them to their destinations quickly. Into this mix, we can throw 2 additional ingredients: union make work and the fire equipment upsell. Over the years, firefighters' unions have introduced contractual language stipulating the minimum numbers of firefighters on a call. Simultaneously, firefighting equipment suppliers have infiltrated the ranks of the organizations drafting the official guidelines for firefighting equipment. The unsurprising outcome, even larger fire trucks. As a result, most cities have found themselves under the protection of fire chiefs who, when introduced to the planning conversation, advocate for 3 things that make their cities more dangerous: wider streets, broader intersections, and the introduction of unwarranted traffic signals. Wider streets. Rule 50 discussed 8-foot lanes and 2-way 12-foot lanes, 2 things that increase safety in most older walkable cities and which are impermissible according to something called the 20-foot clear. And yeah, I know it's gone up to like 24 and 26, depending on who you're talking to.
Right.
20-foot clear appears in the Universal Fire Code, not a law, but a standard that many cities adopt, and requires that all streets maintain 20 feet of clear space between any obstructions such as parked cars. Many fire chiefs apply this law indiscriminately, not realizing that it hails from cul-de-sac suburbia where there is only one path to each fire. When a street can be entered from both ends, there's no longer a need to do what the 20-foot clear allows, which is to park a big truck, put down its stabilizers, and drive another big truck past it. Some fire chiefs, but not all, are willing to reject the 20-foot clear once they learn that it was written for cul-de-sacs. And then I talk about broader intersections and unwarranted traffic signals, but that's basically the conversation on that issue.
I'm glad you read that, because it is, I think one of the things that people don't get from a conversation like this is just the common sense friendly tone of your writing. You are no, I do think it's approachable. You are, I mean, I will just say this and not trying to, we're friends, but your writing is really good. I mean, I don't read many planners actually, because I don't like planning writing in general.
Right.
I love your writing. I think it's very good. I wish you would write more actually, because
I write a lot.
I know.
Yeah. So, the good thing, I suppose, is, I was working in a city. I'm not going to name it because I don't want to get them in trouble.
Sure.
But the fire chief came in and he goes, we demand the 20-foot clear. Mm. And I said, well, that's really a problem. And I explained why. And he goes, oh no, but that includes parked cars. Like, I need 20-foot clear, but then you can park in it.
Right.
And I was like, oh, okay, we're done. No problem.
Yeah.
So there is some room for interpretation. This guy was very smart. He was just doing it his way. But
right.
Anyway, there's more to be said on that topic, I'm sure, but that's about as much as I know.
I'm going to go to this question from Josh. Josh says that you, Jeff, you were referenced in Paul Hawkins' Drawdown, which I'm not familiar with this book, or blog or whatever it is. It says here, walkable cities ranked as the number 54 solution to reversing global warming. Can you talk about the additional side benefits of walkability? And then in parentheses, he puts health, environment, economic, etc.
Yeah.
Go for it.
Well, 54.
Yeah, that was my kind of thought. I was like 54, maybe 5th or 4th.
No, I mean, if you understand, it's like climate change. I don't believe in climate change. I accept climate change. If you understand and accept that most pollution comes from the mobility sector, and most of that comes from commuting, and that of one sort or another, and the principal way that we can have a smaller or a larger carbon footprint in our lives is by making the choice to drive more or less, then that would suggest that the number 1 or 2 way that you can combat climate change is by allowing more people to live in more walkable places. There's a very clear correlation between housing density, which is a stand-in for urbanism, and minimizing. There's an inverse relationship between housing density and the production of carbon. Right. And then there's the larger issue, and the best book on this is called Green Metropolis by David Owen, and I quote it a lot in Walkable City. And one of my chapters is, it's called The Wrong Color Green. And it talks about how we've been addressing the climate issue the wrong way. But he makes it very clear that yes, pollution from the transportation sector is a huge, maybe the biggest problem. But in fact, the real issue is that an automotive-based land planning system causes us to spread out in a way that we're 10 times more wasteful than we would be in a more urban environment. And this is the kind of stuff that you talk about, you know, the excessive and unnecessary and actually unaffordable street systems and sewer systems and electrical systems that are going great distances to bring utilities to limited numbers of people because of this landscape that's only been enabled by the fact that we have this presumption of one automobile per human, right? So that's a big, that's, you know, part of a much larger climate discussion. But I talk in both books, you know, in Walkable City, I have 3 first chapters that are in this first part that's called Why Walkability. And I talk about my experience as a planner of having discovered these 3 groups that were much better at talking to people about making better cities than we planners were, because they talked about things that people cared about. They talked about economics, which of course you talk about. They talked about the environment, and they talked about epidemiology, you know, the health of our society. And you know, the economic story is all about how we've burdened ourselves with tremendous costs, not just because of suburban sprawl, but because of you know, this carapace of steel that we have to carry around with us wherever we go, this 2-ton thing that we, you know, we used to pay 10% of our incomes on transportation in the 70s, and now we pay 20% of our income on transportation because of this system, this stupidly inefficient system that we've created for us. So there's the economic argument. And of course, Walkable City also talks about all the indications about all the people who want to pay a lot of money to be in more urban places. And you can correlate property value with walk score and how much more, you know, how much more productive in terms of creating new patents, for example, urban places are over suburban places, all that stuff. There's a chapter that I alluded to that I just discussed already about the environment. It's based largely on David Owen's book, Green Metropolis. And then there's a chapter that's based largely on a great book called Urban Sprawl and Public Health that you might remember from 2004, written by 2 epidemiologists and a planner, that basically says, look, the reason why we have the first generation of Americans who are expected to live shorter lives than their parents is because we've engineered out of our society the useful walk. You know, walking used to serve a purpose that caused us to be active. And yes, our diet sucks, but in fact, activity is just as important. It's calories in and calories out. And we've made it so that the standard condition of the, you know, typical American is to get no useful activity. You have to add it on, you know, something you add on. And when people add it on, they don't keep it. They don't keep doing it, you know, unless it's a part of their daily lives. So those were the 3 categories. So each one of those, which was a whole big chapter in Walkable City, is a 2-page rule. I have, you know, sell walkability on economy, sell walkability on climate, sell walkability on health. But I added 2 more because I didn't feel confident in the data or my capacity to explain it 6 or 7 years ago, but I do now. And there's one which is community, right? Sell walkability on community and the formation of community and actually social health of and that's based in part in some of Robert Putnam's research about how suburbia kills social connections and how, of course, long commutes mean that you don't participate in stuff in your community, and that's pretty well documented. And then sell walkability on equity, and not just walking but biking. And there's some courses that, in terms of who relies on walkability to get around and who relies on transit to get around, and also who's being killed in traffic by cars. It's a large part the people with the, you know, the least economic strength and you know, demographic minorities who are suffering much more than, you know, your average American. But the surprising thing is cycling. And everyone thinks of cycling as this elitist thing, and when they picture a cyclist, they picture, you know, what we call the mammal, the middle-aged man in Lycra, right? But it turns out that 39% of the people who commute to work by bicycle come from the lowest 25% of income earners.
Right.
So there's a real, and certainly similar for walking. So actually, when you invest in a bike network, you're making a investment in social equity. You're helping those in your community who have the least. So that one's a little bit surprising.
I really appreciate you taking the time. I think we have time for one more, and I'm gonna ask it. Actually, I've got two more. I'll do the second one really quick. As we're talking today, there's a bunch of names of cities that have come up: Des Moines, Davenport, Grand Forks. I want to give you a chance to talk about how your work and your books and the stuff you do is not just a coastal thing. It's not just a big city thing. Can you talk a little bit about how this really is a North American, and really, I think beyond that, but for our largely North American centric audience, this is not just a place, this is not just a book for people in DC and Boston and New York, San Francisco.
No, in fact, I wouldn't use the term "not just." It's almost not a book. No, I wouldn't say that.
Sure.
But most Americans don't live in these exceptional, big, progressive cities.
Right.
We've got plenty of big cities that aren't exceptional or progressive, right? And then we've got the standout cities that have been leading the way in terms of best practices, like New York and Boston and Portland and Seattle and maybe Denver, and a few others, right? A few others. My job in my writing, but also my job in my practice, and I don't work in New York, I don't work in Seattle, I don't work in Portland, is basically to distribute these best practices that are being tested and proved or disproved, but at least figured out in these more progressive places, to distribute these to the communities that might not have otherwise had access to them. Sure. And so the book does that. And, my typical client is a mid-sized city in a non-coastal elite zone. And somehow they put up with me, this Bostonian who went to school forever. But I really, I'm not really pushing the envelope. It's only in the places I go that I'm pushing the envelope.
Right. No, I feel like I said, I feel like the book is very approachable, very readable. I'm going to get a copy for all my fellow Planning Commission members here in my small town, because everything in here is central to the things we struggle with every day. So I thank you for writing it. Last question. What's your favorite?
Let me say before you ask it that I think, this audience, the Strong Towns audience, which I admire and know rather well, I think this is the audience for this second book. I think probably a lot of you have already read the first book. If not, I think you'll really enjoy the first book. And the main reason the first book did so well is it's fun to read and it talks about planning in a way that is, hopefully exciting. But this second book was written for your audience, almost like explicitly.
I see that too. And actually we've got a couple people in the comment section who have said they've just bought the book. So we've sold a couple books for you here in the last hour, and hopefully we'll some more. I mean, if you're listening to this, go get this book. You will be very happy.
You won't regret it.
You won't regret it. What's your favorite? You've got 101 rules. You got to have a favorite. Yeah. What's your favorite?
Well, I kind of hinted at that because I told you I had to add one more.
Okay.
I guess it's not my favorite, but it's the one that I would call to your attention because it's the newest one.
Okay.
I have rules I really enjoy about not falling for autonomous vehicles, about realizing that Uber and Lyft actually are probably are necessary, but we need to treat them according to the fact that they worsen congestion and worsen mobility ultimately in urban places. But the rule I had to add, which you may have heard me when I spoke to the plenary at CNU last year, Congress for New Urbanism, but it's called Don't Let Terrorists Design Your City. And it's about how the mandate to harden cities around fear of some sort of car attack or other thing is actually a losing battle. It makes the landscape less accommodating, and it's wasting money that if it was redirected towards making streets safer would have a incredibly much greater positive impact on public health, and because terrorism is perpetrated upon us and often by people who don't look like us, you know, the amount of money that we throw at it is disproportionate. But the effectiveness of that investment is pretty much zero, because there's always a soft target, and we're always defending against the last attack when there's always, you know, these are smart assholes, but they're smart. You know, there's always, sorry, Midwestern audience. But you know, there's always a new way to do it. And you know, the terrorism is statistically insignificant. I put it down there. And then I talk about how in another chapter, but I refer to it here, there was a street in Queens that experienced, Queens, New York, that experienced 186 car crash deaths. And they invested $22,000 per victim, right? And a victim is worth millions of dollars, according to the federal government's rules. But they invested $22,000 per victim, finally, and traffic calmed it. And now no one's died in 4 years. $22,000 per victim. If you do the math, and this isn't my math, if you do the math, we've invested $1.7 billion per victim of 9/11. Right. So that's a bit of a comparison. But anyway, you can see that I'm very passionate about this. But that, you know, if the others, and I know we're running out of time, so I'll just end with this little sentence. With a limited investment, child traffic deaths in the Netherlands went from more than 400 in 1971 to just 14 in 2010. A small fraction of our current anti-terror budgets transferred to road safety would save thousands of lives. And so that may be my favorite rule, but it's the one that upsets some people. Right. Maybe that's why I like.
I appreciate what you said just now and also earlier about kind of, I think, the social benefits that we're starting to recognize. And I, you know, you said a few years ago, I wasn't as confident talking about them, and I'm with you. I think the awareness of how badly we need each other and how, you know, the spaces that we've created are really not conducive to human life. It is not human habitat the way we're kind of evolved to deal with each other, is having some real pernicious effects. And I appreciate what this book is doing to help us knit some of those things back together. Absolutely. Jeff?
You know, even when I started doing this with Andres and Liz, you know, 25 years ago, even then they were saying that it's, you know, the chance encounters between non-family and friends in the public sphere that are responsible for the advancement of civil discourse in our society.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your time. I love talking to you, and I really value the ability to take the time to do this. Thank you to everybody who logged in and attended and had questions. Jeff, you got through like 12 questions, which I don't know. That seemed really a lot more than I thought we would get to. Great answers.
Well, I tend to give long answers, so I'm surprised we did that well. But thanks everybody for listening, and I do hope you'll check the book out. And Chuck, keep doing what you do.
Keep doing what you do to build strong towns. Walkable City Rules, 101 Steps to Making Better Places. You got it there again? Can you hold it up so people can see it? And if you're listening to this on podcast, we're going to have that. There we go. We're going to have the link to it on the website. So go there and pick it up. Walkable City Rules, Jeff Speck. Thank you so much, my friend.
Thank you. See you soon.
See you soon. Bye-bye.